Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and this is my great good friend Hoyt Richards. You've become my great good friend. This is a great thing. I love this.
So do I. Jon. Very much so.
And we were just talking about a film festival you've been to, where escaping from COVID-19 for a few moments there, where you saw some material about trauma in soldiers, and of course you're working on your own documentary series at the moment, which is about the trauma of being involved with eternal values and groups of this kind, authoritarian cult groups, and the parallels. And what you're saying is about trauma and whether we face trauma and how we face trauma. And so if you could reflect on that, I'd be very interested.
Oh, absolutely. This film I saw, it was called Bastard Road, and it followed this soldier who had fought in Afghanistan. And it was a very, very powerful film, very emotional. I mean, there was not a dry eye in the house. And it basically cataloged his journey from having come back from, I think he'd had 2 or 3 tours over in Afghanistan and suffered, through the horrors of that war experience, watching their friends get either brutally damaged, and wounded or killed, and just being in those incredibly, I can only imagine, such heightened life and death situations where you're just literally not only fighting for your life, but fighting for your wits to even get through it. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating because it's obviously dealing with the aftermath and how do you make sense of that. And it interviewed a lot of the soldiers, and one soldier in particular, one of the things he said really, really resonated with me, because I've heard about this trauma bond that occurs from people when you go through something traumatic together. And I certainly feel on some level I experienced that even in my cultic relationship. Obviously the stakes aren't as high as the battleground, so to speak, but when you're terrified in your body, whatever way it gets there, I think you still have a similar response. And certainly in our group, since we were a doomsday cult and we were planning for the end of the world, there was a constant fear and walking on eggshells that at any moment the proverbial shit could hit the fan. And I think in that sense, I can identify to some degree. Obviously, I would never compare it, apples to apples with this. But one of the soldiers was saying he had just kind of resolved himself that he was going to probably just die, and he was okay with that because it just seemed to be inevitable because of the situation. Mm-hmm. And he said, but he goes, I think I'll probably die trying to save one of these idiots over here because I love them more than anything. Mm-hmm. And I can see really the thing I'm willing to die for and will do it, starting, at any moment, is to save their lives because they care. I care about them more than anything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really fascinating angle on it, to see that the so-called cause that you're going there to do is not nearly as impactful as the relationships that you develop through being in these situations. Obviously, the cause can be, wonderful. And there was another film that actually dealt with D-Day and that in the Normandy area and all these, they have all these great ceremonies where they invite U.S. soldiers back to thank them for liberating that country. And that was a beautiful story because, I think a lot of soldiers I certainly think in America, don't really get the recognition and acknowledgement for what they did for certain other countries in that certain way. So there's a lot of unhealed things there, but I don't want to get off on that tangent too much. But the film, this one was dealing with trauma, to me was really, really fascinating because what this soldier decided, because he was just having such a hard time making sense of the world post-war, that he decided he was just going to walk and literally walked from one side of the country. I think he started somewhere in the southeast. I don't know if it was Florida or one of the Carolinas or Georgia, but he basically starts this walk where he decides as many of his ex-soldiers from his unit he's going to try to reconnect with, so that he can at least let them know how much they mean to him and how hard and how much he's struggling, and how difficult of a time he's having with life. And it's this incredible journey of where you have this guy walking on his own, experiencing a ton of self-reflection, but every time he reconnects with one of his old soldier buddies, it's this wonderful moment of this deep love and I can only describe it, this trauma bond. I mean, there's this thing that I certainly know that I went through it, even in trying to make sense of my whole cultic experience. The first 15 years of my recovery was largely on my own, in the sense that no one from the group that I'd been in had any interest in pursuing that path of recovery, or even acknowledging it was a cult, or even willing to have a conversation that could it be. There was one guy who I've become very good friends with more recently, who could acknowledge that it was a cult, and that was a huge win for both of us. But when it came down to how each of us wanted to initially talk about it, or not talk about it, I wanted to talk about it. He wanted to just acknowledge it and move on. And so that created an impasse. So I literally went on this 15-year exodus to try to make sense of it. And I spoke with a lot of other cult survivors, and that was always useful and helpful to kind of know that other people went through something similar. But it's not the same thing as talking to the people that were actually there. And I think that's such an important part of the healing process. And to watch this soldier reconnect with his fellow friends from the unit, it was a beautiful thing that you could just see the compassion and understanding and connection they had. And to me, that was the most powerful part of the film. And then the way they would discuss and just the release of so much kind of guilt and frustration that I think a lot of people have trying to explain to someone else what they've gone through, where it's kind of an understood language that doesn't even have to be explained to the people that were actually there. And I thought that was a fascinating thing to watch. And he basically makes his way all the way to California, and he is greeted by the by the military itself. They literally celebrate him for what he's done, because he's basically acknowledged all these different soldiers and their issues with PTSD, and is providing a kind of a platform to make this subject something that needs to be talked about and certainly dealt with. And I just think, our like trauma doesn't seem to be something we can avoid in our lives. I mean, I just think it happens, right? And so I just think it's so fascinating to realize that it's never going to go away. It's just up to you whether you choose to deal with it or not, or whatever way you choose to deal with it will largely dictate your existence moving forward. For my case, it's been decades, and that's been really interesting to experience. And not everyone makes that choice, and so it's been interesting to recognize that that there are many choices out there, and I'm just grateful for the ones I've made so far. And films like that really helped reassure me that I'm not out of my mind to want to to talk about these things and kind of and have the conversations and try to figure things out. And like I say, you can't avoid trauma. It's never going to go away, but you can learn to accept it, manage it, and it can actually become something quite empowering, because I think what trauma teaches us, and it certainly taught me, is that we're probably a lot stronger than we'd ever give ourselves credit for. And going through something intensely traumatic, in a sense of finding ourselves in a situation we never imagined we'd find ourselves, and then somehow finding a way, obviously not only to survive it, but then figure it out and at least diagnose it and acknowledge it and own it, then it can become this reference point that's incredibly empowering, because as you approach more difficult situations moving forward, you recognize, well, I've been through this other thing that I never thought I'd ever get out of. And so whatever I'm going to face, I think I'll be able to handle, and I'll just take it on just as something that it's only happening because I can handle it. And I think that's been a really kind of empowering thing for me to say. I guess it's been a belief that's come out of this whole journey, that I just don't think we're ever put into a situation we can't handle. And I guess that's where faith starts to play into the equation a little bit, that that the universe in some way is conspiring in your favor. We're not cursed, and we're not meant to just never figure things out and never heal and never learn and grow from it all.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in what you just said. The first thing is you remind me of Mark Laxer, who cycled across America to recover from his experiences. And we're talking about a journey. Now, if we go to Joseph Campbell, and we often do, then
Right.
He says everybody's a hero because everybody went through the trauma of birth. And we can add to that everybody is going towards the trauma of death. So,
right. Yes, right.
Whether there's anything on the other side of that or no, I'm with Jung Soo. I've no idea, and I don't care, frankly. But between the forceps and the stone, there is our existence, and we will lose things. We will be hurt. We'll have all sorts of experiences that are traumatic. And what you say is absolutely true. That how we choose to deal with trauma, whether we choose to deal with trauma, is going to be the way forward. That my experience is different to most people who are in authoritarian cults, because I had a fine time in the cults. It's all fine. It was only after I left and started feeling the full weight of Scientology's harassment teams, which went on nonstop for 16 years, that I understood the kind of trauma that could result.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many people. We were talking before about my conversation with Mike Grinder, and
Yes.
I first met Mike in 94, 95, somewhere around there. And though we've exchanged a few emails in the last few years, it was an incredible pleasure getting to sit and talk with this guy, and him saying, well, look, when I met you before, you seemed like a nice guy, but you were opposed to Scientology, so you had to be destroyed. And it's that easy, And
I think that was one of the things that's fascinating as a viewer watching that, because I get that. It's very matter of fact. I mean, it's this type of thing of just accepting something, not based on the fact that you came to it organically on your own. You've just accepted this as the dogma. This is where dogma gets so dangerous, right? Like, I think that one of the most effective ways that these cultic groups operate is they give you enough things that are based in truth initially, that you then identify it, or them, or whoever the source, as a truthful, truth speaker, so to speak. Yep. And then we project onto that, oh, well, they're a source of truth, so now I can accept whatever they're going to say. And then all of a sudden, all the BS comes your way, and you can't tell the difference, because you literally just, made that decision unconsciously, more than likely. And that's when you get yourself in hot water. So I could see how, Mike Rinder's just doing his job. I mean, and not seeing, he's not even looking at it potentially as, he's not looking at you, taking it personally or anything. It's like, listen, I just got to do my job.
I'm going to kill you, but there's nothing personal about it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's absolutely what happens in a Holocaust.
Yeah.
In a genocide, that the opponent is seen as subhuman, vermin, something that is opposing the progress of humanity. And you can see it through the Crusades. You can, wherever we go, where people do violence to others, there's some justification of Übermensch and Untermensch. And I mean, one of the things that I've worked a lot to try and understand the idea of predation and human predators and the various and many forms of human predator. But the one that fascinates me the most is the weaponized empath. People who are like Mike Rinder, actually really good, kind, considerate people who, because of that, can be employed by some guru. You know, Hannah Whitfield would be another example from the crew that were around Hubbard, who's just the sweetest and most pleasant of human beings. And yet she ran the ethics section, which is to say she doled out the punishments for Hubbard.
Right, right.
And he seemed to revel in that. And I think many such people do. I've just finished watching Seduced, the thing about Keith Raniere, a man who couldn't even pronounce his own name properly. It says Raniere, not Raniere. You know, I mean, how foolish can you get? But he does now have 120 years in prison to live through. But astonishing to see how readily people can be funneled into this belief. As you say, Yuval Noah points out that once we've had an inexplicable experience, he was using the word miracle when I first met him, but I think that's a little insulting to people who believe in such things. But something inexplicable happens. We don't understand how we got that euphoric high, particularly, or, you know, how that person seemed to glow with the golden light when we saw them. Something happens, and then we trade our certainty. We say, this person knows better than I do, and I will trust them. And so, you know, looking back at Scientology and the absolute madness that Hubbard spouted, you know, we're all descended from clams, for example, and this kind of stuff, that you sorted this out and you sort of put the stuff that was crazy over into the left field, and you grabbed hold of the stuff that you believed in. And I strongly believe, I don't believe it's the charisma of individuals that traps us. In small groups that can happen, but in the bigger groups, you never meet the leader. The charisma of the leader is something that comes maybe through film or tape, but it's the text, it's the dogma that saturates one's being, and trying to make sense of that dogma, which usually has all sorts of conflicts and contradictions in it as well. Completely.
I know it's fat. I mean, and I love Yuval's work for that reason. I mean, he actually describes it as a mini seizure. You know, it's like a computer that's overrun. It's like, this doesn't compute. You know, you have this kind of, you know, short circuiting experience, of which people could attribute it to be a miracle or some sort of, you know, awakening, because there's a tangible thing that happens, and it certainly happens. It can happen individually in your own head. It can certainly happen in a group context. There's this very tangible feeling of euphoria that can happen when there's supposedly some great epiphany occurring that you experience it at a sporting event sometimes. That you know, it's so it's not that something isn't happening that you're imagining. It's that trying to translate what you're experiencing into something that actually makes, you know, rational sense, you know, and I think that's where we're really challenged, and that's where no one warns us that we as humans have this up against us, that there are certain areas that when it doesn't compute, we fall prey to being massively influenced by whoever potentially has the loudest voice at the time, or whoever we've put in the position of authority to say, this is what you're experiencing, rather than doing the self-investigation, knowing that this is kind of a inherent, I don't know if I can call it a flaw, but it's just an inherent part of the human psyche that we get in these situations, and we really, it takes time to really process what is really being experienced, rather than what we want to leap towards to say it's this. Because I think there's such a fascination we all have with magic and miracles and all the, I mean, who doesn't? I love, I'm in the movie business. I love all that sort of stuff, but you know, that can be a dangerous road to hoe. And I think if you're unaware that that's kind of a very sensitive proclivity for each of us, then you can fall prey to the certain things like you and I did with these type of things, that we all fall prey in different ways to these type of influences all the time.
And when we are uncertain, we seek certainty. So, you know, the 45% of medical doctors in Germany joined the Nazi Party. 45%. Now, these are people who are all of them, every one of them, a lot more educated than Adolf Hitler.
Yes, correct.
But he offered them certainty when all they had was, were they actually going to be able to eat for the week? So, and I think that it so frequently happens that some narcissistic human being, because that projection of certainty, and the paradox is that the most uncertain people in the world are narcissists. They have no self. They have no developed self.
Right.
So they only get it from adulation. And so when they go out in public, like seeing Rajneesh, who's, conning his followers into believing he's under a vow of silence, because he's basically taking so much diazepam, so much Valium. Hugh Milner's bodyguards had 50 milligrams a day, which is about, it's taken in 2 or 5 milligram doses, plus 2 hits of nitrous oxide an hour long a day. And of course he's wandering out there and he can't speak, But it projects as this, he's floating on this cloud of bliss. In fact, Marianne Sheila said he was taking up to 340 milligrams of diazepam a day, which I think would probably kill anybody. But so there's this public projection of the guru who in private, and, talking about Lentz with Mark Laxer, who was right next to him, you've got this person who collapses, the narcissistic collapse happens. And in private, they're a complete shambles, but in public, they've learned how to project certainty. And they feel certain, for those moments when the crowd holds them in awe, they feel certain. And then they go back to their bedroom and cry again and drink another bottle of whiskey or what have you. So, incredible contradiction there. One of the things that really, really interests me is resistance to recovery. Now,
I think that's a great subject. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead. Tell me.
My friend Jesse Prince, who was the overlord of the Scientology technology for a period of time, he's written, and he's such a funny guy. He's got so many great stories. I love him. But he wrote that it took him, I think, 6 years from buying Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, my book about Scientology, my history of Scientology, 6 years from buying it to being able to open it. And thereafter, he'd read it 3 times, and he said everybody needs to read it 3 times because there's so much information in it, and there really is quite a lot in there. But that resistance, the lifting the cover, the being able to look at the condition now.
I think it's the hardest thing for people to do, and I think we talked about it a little bit the last time we spoke, that it's very easy for any of us to be manipulated and certainly conned, but it is very hard for people to admit that happened, and that is really where the problem exists. So it's this, and it's fascinating because in a certain sense, I was between a rock and a hard place from the point of view that when I escaped our group and I was, trying to make sense of what happened, and I went through the initial PTSD of just having no idea what it was, not being able to take any, like people over the years had said it was a cult, and I was like, there's no way it's a cult. Now this is speaking completely from a person of massive ignorance about cults. Like my only understanding of cults at that time was things I'd seen in the media. So whether it was Jonestown or the people who the ones who thought they were going off into space.
Heaven's
Gate, exactly that. And
Order of the Solar Temple.
Manson,
Restoration of the 10 Commandments.
Right.
They're cults.
Yeah, very extreme versions. So my main premise over the years had been, when anyone had the courage to even broach that subject, like, oh, you sure it might not, it sounds a little culty. And I'd be like, you think I would join a cult? And my whole premise for it couldn't be that was the fact that I was in the group. Like that's, I'm like, well, as far as I know, someone like me would never join a cult. So the fact that I am in the group means it can't be a cult. And that was literally the platform I stood on for the 20 years I was in the thing. And it was only when I was having such a hard time making sense of life in general after I escaped, because then when I escaped, it wasn't like I'd identified what it was. I just had realized I couldn't stay there any longer. And I actually felt I was holding the group back, and I was actually a dead weight, that the only true divine thing I could do was relieve them of my lost cause, because the true seekers were never going to give up on me. And it was that type of convoluted thing that at least my I guess you could say the human spirit in me found a way to get me out the door, as convoluted as that rationale was. But then in the aftermath, I was like, well, what was it? And I was very confident that it wasn't a cult. So I'm like, well, what was it? And I was so convinced, because of the way the brainwashing had gone down, that this was such a special, unique opportunity that no one who I would actually have a conversation with outside the group could possibly understand what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so I really stayed in that wormhole for a long time. Like, who could I ever explain this to? No one's going to ever understand. I knew enough to think that they'll think I'm crazy, even though I knew I wasn't. And that was kind of the dilemma I was in. And, it was one of these things of, luckily, this is when I connected with this guy who had also left the group. And it was through those initial conversations that we had of just kind of trying to break things down, just deconstruct things. Like, wasn't it strange when this thing happened? And remember when this happened and this person said this and that? That's when I had the possibility that, okay, maybe this is something that I'm not willing to look at right now. But I was in such pain, I just figured I have to just, like, I was pretty confident it wasn't a cult, but I said, why don't I start there, because that'll at least move me towards the road. Like, if I can cross off cult, then I'll get closer to what it might be. and of course, the first book I got on it was Steve Hassan's book, and of course I even had prejudice going into that, because he was in the Moonies, and I was like, well, God, the people who get involved in the Moonies, I mean, I saw them in airports. Like, sure, that's a cult. Like, how did you get involved in that? So I had my own prejudice against that. Mm-hmm. But I was like, it had so many good reviews. I figured, okay, well, I'll just read about it. So at least, he seems to know something about the subject matter. And that's how my eyes, the first, I don't know, 60, 70 pages was how he'd been indoctrinated. So that was what opened my eyes. I'm like, oh my God, it's a cult. But then I was really between the rock and the hard place of, I knew that if you Googled my name at that time, because I'd been, somewhat in the public eye, it would come up all these terrible articles that saying that this group that I was involved in was a cult. And now I knew it was a cult. And now I'm like, what do I do? How do I, and I was kind of forced to realize, like, if I don't change the narrative, this is what the narrative is going to be. And this is not going to go away, because once it's something on the internet, it can stay there forever. So that I was forced to kind of confront it and talk about it to start to alter the narrative. And it began with me first acknowledging it was a cult, and that I fought for many years to say it wasn't. And that was all part of the process and the programming. It was in me kind of coming out of it. And it's really, really painful, because this goes back to the heading of what we're talking about, the resistance to recovery. And I think it's so hard to swallow that cult pill or whatever, the trauma pill, because for me, I had to go back to the beginning. And we're, at this point, we're talking, it would have been around 2000, and I met him when I, like 20 years. Okay, so I'm going back 2 decades to where I met this guy on the beach on Nantucket when I was 16, and I now have to start reframing my life with this new lens, that from that moment I had someone influencing me that did not have my best interest in mind. And through that influence, I made choices and did things and said things to people I care about, or didn't say things at times when I wish I could have. I had to just reframe 2 decades of my life with this new perspective. And that's terrifying. So I understand the resistance, because even if 98% of your life confirms the fact that this was a cultic relationship and it was dangerous and a lot of people got hurt and traumatized in the process, if there's 2% that you can hold on to that says, no, I don't really think it was that. No, I don't want to deal with that. You will cling to that 2% with tooth and nail, because it's terrifying. And just like your friend said, the longer it goes on, each year you add, the more daunting it becomes in your mind, and the harder it seems to be. It's like, because you keep stacking the years that you have to go back. And I won't say this conscious at the time, but there's this unconscious knowing that you have a lot to unpack if you make that acknowledgement. And I think that's a lot of that resistance, because it's terrifying. And it's just like anything in therapy. It always sounds so much worse in your head when you're thinking about it. But when you finally blurt it out in your therapy session or to your friend, you're like, okay, well, it's not great, but it's not that bad. Like it's never as bad as it seems inside your head.
It's like that little list of jobs that you have that you really don't want to do, and when you get to them, it takes you 5 minutes.
Exactly.
You manage to put them off.
Yeah, it's me and taxes. I hate doing income tax. Like I mean, with a passion. But when I finally sit down and do it, I'm like, this actually doesn't take that long. Like, okay, it is a total nuisance and all, but for me to keep postponing it and to just have it way, in my head, I'm like, oh, guys, I got to do my taxes.
Right. In this country, you're fined £100 if you don't file by December the 31st. And I have managed to do it within 1 hour of the filing time. I have some idea of what you're talking about here.
Well, you see, I'm not alone. I'm happy to hear
there
that.
There are 2 of us that don't like tax forms in the world. There may be, we could form a club. There may be a third person,
That's right. I think there's probably a few out there. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's where a lot of that resistance comes from. The daunting task of having to look at your life through a new perspective, and one that unfortunately doesn't largely shine brightly upon yourself, and it also involves taking ownership for actions, which, although yes, you were influenced, you still have to take ownership for. And that's hard to do. And but that's why I love Brene Brown's work. I think she does wonderful work in that area. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
No.
Yeah, no, Brene Brown does a lot of work. I think that one of her first books was Daring Greatly, but she basically she's basically talking about how the only she references that famous Theodore Roosevelt thing of unless you're the man in the arena, I really don't have very much interest in what you have to say. So unless you're willing to kind of engage your own life and actually be a player in your own life, rather than the spectators who will throw tomatoes and thorns at you, it's like, why pay attention to those people? The only people that really matter are the people that are actually choosing to take ownership of their own story, engaging it, and actually, trying to find their way out and talking about it. And John, it's shame. So she basically says the only cure for shame is, basically transparency and ownership of, your experience, and through that, it's like anything. The shame of the idea is so overwhelming, but when you finally actually start talking about it, you're completely liberated. And this idea that if you talk about these things that you fear others are going to possibly judge you on, or look at you lesser than because of it, very often the result is the opposite, because we all have things we're completely traumatized by, things that we're terrified about admitting. And when someone comes forward and admits some of those things, the things that they would hold shame around, it's you talk about how you change a conversation in a moment, because it's like all of a sudden, to use the euphemism, shit gets real. like someone all of a sudden confides, talking about somebody like, initially I would do it just by dropping the cult bomb and saying, well, yeah, there'd be some sort of thing in the conversation. I'm like, oh, well, that reminds me of something I used to think like that when I was in the cult. And people were like, did you just say you were in a cult? And I was like, yeah, I did. And with the idea that I would want to foster a conversation, but the fact that I was initially talking about a subject that anyone normally, would think, oh my God, if that had happened to me, I'd never talk about it. The fact that I was volunteering it and actually, wanting to engage in conversation allowed us to have this kind of discourse that made it safe ground for any conversation of any subject. So not only am I allowed to take ownership of what this thing I went through that I'm not so proud about, but learned a lot from, and want to kind of share the so-called silver linings in it as well to admitting to what happened, it fosters a kind of conversation where someone's like, well, God, I wasn't in a cult, but I went through this and compared, that doesn't sound so bad. Why don't I volunteer this? And I ended up having these incredible conversations. And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity and that's why I love the work that Brene Brown does, because she says, unless we're able to address, the shame, and you do it through, through humility and just being honest. And it's an incredibly powerful tool, and people end up respecting you for it. So this thing that you think, if you admit that people are going to look down on you, it's generally not the case. And if they do that, then it pretty much reveals a lot more about them than it does about you. So it's a very useful tool.
Yeah, and you got to the key word, I think, which is humility.
Yeah.
I speak as somebody who, for decades thought that modesty was probably a reasonable thing. I don't have a trumpet, so I can't blow it. But that humility was some kind of weird extremist sort of thing that monks had to have, or something like that. And
right.
it finally, I was probably in my 50s by the time I got there. I finally looked at it and said, well, that's the key ingredient. Because if I can look at my own life without needing to protect my ego, without having to defend myself from seeing who I am, then I might be able to get somewhere. And it is a very difficult thing because throughout childhood, saving face it's so important to be seen as something. And I think perhaps for you it was even more difficult because you were a star. You were somebody who had been such a success publicly, and yet privately you'd been enslaved. You'd been taken in by this group and taken over. So you had further to fall than most people, I suppose, in terms of humility, in terms of addressing that and saying, I was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to say whether it's further to fall. I mean, who knows? I mean, but it's certainly, I had a more distinct picture of that kind of double life that I think anyone has when they have these kind of relationships, because there's so many secrets. There's so much, kind of the, as we were talking about earlier, the us versus them. So and the people within the group, there's this supposed complete transparency amongst, you're supposed, the cult of confession type stuff. You got to, say everything that's going on. But people on the outside, you're very camouflaged, and you're learning to spin doctor. You're learning to kind of how to present things to engage the people in the matrix, right? It's that kind of thing. When I got involved in my with Eternal Values, it was very much that feeling that they had extracted me from the matrix, and now I was discovering the truth. And therefore, anytime I had to engage with people on the outside, they were in the matrix unconsciously, didn't even know they were in the matrix. So they were also unconsciously potentially working against me, because now I was aligned with the forces of light, and they were, going to always try to sabotage me. So that's why I had to push back and be careful with them, and, not be around my family, and anything that could possibly pull me back into the matrix was going to be dangerous. And I mean, it's obviously not the truth, but that was the way it felt. And that's the way I dealt with the people on the outside, was thinking that, they could turn into an agent that could kill me at any time, like in the movie.
Yeah. And I mean, have you seen the movie Sorry to Bother You?
No.
It's absolutely brilliant. It's a really fine, funny, insightful piece, beautifully made, differently made. But there's a point in it where one of the characters says, "You're harshing my mellow," and it's almost like this like, you've got to create this perfect state somehow, and anything from the outside could interfere with it. Yes. And so you learn to exclude other people and, seek perfect narcissism.
No, it's a self-censoring mechanism, right? I mean, you only take in information that maintains the paradigm, right? I mean, it's kind of, and it's kind of what they describe when you're dealing with people with narcissistic personality disorder. They literally have created an alternative universe that they inhabit, that they're kind of the center of.
Yeah.
And any information that doesn't fit within that paradigm, it's literally like they have earmuffs on and cannot hear it. So you, as the person attempting to communicate with them, you're trying to be very clear, because if you've had difficulty with these people, which they usually are difficult to communicate with, you're very careful with the words you choose and trying to be clear and making an analogy or an example and that sort of thing. And you feel very potentially confident that you've explained yourself well. And then literally 5 minutes later, they will say something or react in a certain way as if you didn't even have that conversation. And if you don't know what you're dealing with, which of course, I didn't at the time, the only place you end up is going, well, my God, I guess I really am a terrible communicator, because I really thought I was just explained that well, and yet it just didn't land. And you don't realize you're up against an abnormal psyche that just can't actually hear what you're saying. So it's not that you didn't express yourself well, it's just that individual couldn't even hear it because of their own condition.
Yeah, which is confirmation bias, or I prefer that there's a scholar who's decided to call it my side bias, which I think is, I don't like most of the terms used in psychology because they're not very clever. I'd much rather, I understood what's, talk to me about exploitative persuasion. I know what you're talking about. Talk to me about menticide. I've got no idea. And I think that's a lot of it, how we frame things. That, that I spent 7 years after I left Scientology learning how to talk to people who'd been involved in Scientology.
Yes.
And after that time, I could sit down and pretty much in a day with anybody, no matter how deeply they were involved, if they would talk with me, because that was the only problem, that if they knew my name, they wouldn't talk to me. But if they would talk to me, they would reconsider their involvement. That led me to somebody whose situation was similar to yours, that they left Scientology believing that they were a damaging and harmful person. Hubbard had told this person they were suppressive.
Right.
A word that Keith Raniere picked up, the NXIVM.
Right.
Interestingly enough, along with various other aspects of Scientology. But this guy, therefore, believing himself dangerous to humanity, locked himself in his house for 20 years.
Wow.
And after I talked with him, and that was it. He was now going out, he got a job, everything happened. I was furious at this thought that, there is, we get from these groups the idea that the universe is teaching us lessons, or that we have to go through these things and what have you. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't think the universe is thinking about anything,
Yeah. No, but it's a very powerful technique, right? I mean, I was having a conversation about this the other day with someone about, because I think it's so important when you get into the actual behavior that happens in the group to obviously acknowledge where things went wrong and became abusive. So it's not that I in any way want to brush over those things, but they're because they're quite salacious generally, whether it gets into the actual psychological or even physical abuse or sexual, these are the things that, what I would call the low-hanging fruit of these stories.
Yeah.
And it's very easy, if focused upon too much, that they take away, to me, the proper lens of the storytelling, which is not the details of what you got up to or what you ended up believing or what the group stood for per se. That's not nearly as important as to acknowledge where you started, which was a rational thinking individual like the rest of us, and you somehow ended up in that place. And most importantly, you figured out at some point that's not where you wanted to be and got yourself out. And how did you make sense of it then? And how did you heal? That's the real story. That's the critical part of the story. But the temptation to get into the minutia of the salacious behavior or the belief systems, because the truth is, you can look at any religion and it's like, just pick your crazy. Like, now some of them have been around so long that it's accepted crazy, so that's not even considered crazy anymore. But the truth is, it doesn't really matter what crazy you pick. The question is, how did you get to the point where you accepted the crazy? And more importantly, how did you at some point realize it wasn't working and got yourself out? And how did you move down that road to recovery and make sense of it? That's the critical story. And that's why, like, even, I'm curious what you thought about Seduced, because I know the director, and she's a very, very sweet, smart woman, and she went on a massive learning curve in telling the story. And I consulted a bit on it, and my main role in talking to a lot of the girls who are survivors was just to tell them, listen, what you guys have done is extraordinary, and the fact that you have each other, because I said, you guys have such a, coming from someone who had to basically go on their own for 15 years, I said, you have a sisterhood network here amongst yourselves where you guys have been through the war together. I said, and I encourage you to utilize that if you can. But I said, I also want to forewarn you that there's a lot of work ahead, and it doesn't have, I go, intellectually, you can put a lot of dots together and you can be fairly competent about talking about what your experience was. I said, the emotional processing of this experience is going to take years, if not decades. I said, for me, it's taken decades and it's ongoing. I said, and I don't mean that to scare you, but just to acknowledge that this is the way it works, and to encourage you to embrace it, because the opportunity and the lessons learned along the way are fantastic. But you have to just, I said, I would feel bad not telling you to go in with your eyes open, that it's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best pieces ever made.
That's what I thought
about cults, because I mean, for at least the last 25 years, whenever a documentary maker has come to me, I've said the same things, which is, if you are going to deal with any one of these four areas, I'll work with you. And very often I end up working for free. That's just the way it is,
right?
And that's okay. Or it used to be, but people have to pay me from now on.
Right.
The first thing is, how and why do people become involved?
Right.
Now, what is the process of recruitment, and what is it that makes people vulnerable? Those two areas. I've spent 40 years studying that. I have some idea about what it is. What is it that gets somebody to stay once they become involved? Because they'll inevitably experience bad things, and see awful things. What is it that keeps them there? And that varies from one person to another. How did they come to leave? Did they walk out? Were they thrown out? Were they talked out? Were they, as in your case, shamed out?
Right.
And then finally, and probably most importantly for those, or certainly for those who've been involved, how do you recover? And I'd like to add a caveat to what you've just said, and that is, in 37 years of dealing with ex-members and having dealt directly with more than 600, recovery time is incredibly variable. And some people really do catch hold incredibly quickly. When we look at PTSD, there's this idea that a small amount of people, 15 or 16% of people, cannot suffer from PTSD. They are resilient. It doesn't matter what you put them through, they somehow don't have that response. I think about the guy who was he lived in Dachau.
Yeah.
This guy lived in Dachau. He was Jewish. He then went into Dachau, the camp, and when he left, he went back to his house. And people said, how can you possibly live in Dachau after what happened to you? And he's like, it's where I grew up. It's where I live. It's not necessarily saying that it's a good thing, right. in that case, but that it is variable. And what seems, in my experience, what seems to happen is that we should differentiate post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a 24/7 condition where events keep replaying themselves through your life, right, and post-traumatic stress. Now, I experience post-traumatic stress. Whenever I see a manila envelope, I think it'll probably be a writ from Scientology because there were so many of them. Whenever I see a little beeping light on my answer phone machine, I think it will be a call from a lawyer. Now, I haven't actually been engaged in litigation with Scientology for 20 years now. And what I can say is it has less, my heart doesn't leap anymore.
Right.
So the response gets less. Now, I'm not going to name a name, but a very well-known figure in the academic ex-cult world told me that if a combat veteran still grieves for his fallen comrades, then his therapy is not complete. This guy has a PhD. I had to be restrained at that point because I would very much like to explain that if you are actually a human being, then that which was dreadful that happened in your life will always be dreadful. Exactly. It is how much response it evokes. And you then find, the occasional person like Viktor Frankl, for example, who went through Auschwitz. I think he was in Dachau before he was in Auschwitz, actually.
Incredible guy.
And yet managed to turn that into, again, Joseph Campbell calls it an ambrosial book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he somehow tells you how being in Auschwitz was a very positive experience in some ways for him. And he, of course, goes on to further develop his logotherapy, to further point out why Freud was so totally and utterly wrong, disastrously wrong, and make something of his something remarkable out of the trauma. So, and I think that's been true for you. I think it's certainly true for India Oxenberg and the various other people represented there. There's further to go, but sometimes that little Zen moment can happen. And I'm not a big fan of Zen Buddhism either. I was a Zen Buddhist, so I speak with some experience. I treat it's cultic. That's all there is I can say about it. However, some of the ideas that float out, this idea of just touching somebody on the spot with an idea that will transform the way they think about the world, does happen. And it's a gift that's given to all of us who have had the experience and who have realized the experience, that we can occasionally find somebody who has had, who's also had the experience, and they're trapped and struggling in the experience. And we can, with one little poke, open up the next part of the road. I tell the same story again and again. Anybody who knows me knows this story. But 8 years ago, I was approached by an Australian TV journalist, Steve Kinane, who wrote a brilliant book called Fair Game about Scientology in Australia, a beautifully researched book, it's comic. You're just so caught up in the idiocy of Hubbard resisting this one man who wanted $3,000 back. And that caused the whole series of inquiries, the whole world round, just because he wouldn't give the money back. It caused inquiries which closed Scientology down almost. But Steve said to me, look, he'd interviewed this young woman and she'd been abused as a child in Scientology by a Scientologist who subsequently confessed and was convicted, just in case anybody has any doubts about this. At 11 years old, she'd gone to the police and told her story. And before anything happened, a woman came from the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, a woman called Jan Eastgate, Scientologist, and convinced her to withdraw her statement. Now, I personally believe that police officers that were involved at this point should suffer prosecution for allowing this to happen. She was an 11-year-old girl, but it's a long time ago. Then she went back into the household of the abuser at Scientology's direction. It's not the only time I've heard this story. At 16, to escape, she joined Scientology's Sea organization, their inner so-called elite, their monastic organization. And she has an absolutely horrendous time for 5 years because everybody is told that she's a sexual predator, that she seduced this man when she was 6 or 7 years old, and that everybody therefore is watching her all the time. That this crazy situation. She leaves at 21. She goes and gets a degree in medical science. And Steve says to me, look, will you please talk with this woman? And I say to him, I don't do this stuff anymore. I'm so sorry. And then he pleads a bit more and I go, all right. And that was the first, I came back to talking to ex-members, which I still don't do very much of. At that point, we've been talking for 8 years. And I thought, I added up the numbers and went, oh, she was about 20, she'd be about 25, because she finished her degree and what have you. She was 37 years old.
Wow.
And in her first conversation with me, having grown up in Scientology, she said, is it true that reality is an agreement, as Ron Hubbard announces? We're all of us agreeing that it's all out there and that's why it's out there. There is a lecture where he says we're all chanting space particle position all the time. I have not met anybody yet who was chanting that, but obviously his experience was different to mine. And I said to her, well, yes, if you're a hypnotist and with your followers, then yes, reality has become an agreement. But otherwise, no, it's out there. That's the determination I've made. Whether I want it to be out there or not, reality is out there. And I then have my perception of it. Next week when we spoke, she said that she'd used scented fabric conditioner in her laundry. Now, that was an incredible moment because we hadn't talked about Ron Hubbard's hygiene hat that all Sea organization members go through. Nobody else in Scientology is told this, but the secret is that, in fact, perfume is what's being used to control us all. Didn't know that, did you? And particularly rose perfume, that's very dangerous. I don't know if we're allowed to sniff roses or not, but Hubbard had a scent phobia, just as Rajneesh had a scent phobia. It's not uncommon in people who have disordered brains.
Right.
And she'd broken the taboo without having a conversation with me. Mm-hmm. And that meant that the process of recovery would now proceed, because the process of recovery is not thousands of hours of counseling. The process of recovery, or one aspect of it, is realizing you can challenge the guru's wisdom. And once you've done that, you can do it again, and it gets easier and easier. But it is often just that one conversation that allows you to be in charge of your own thoughts. It allows you to decide how you feel and what you think, which is, of course, what's been robbed to greater or lesser extent through occultic involvement.
Right. And I think that's the process that, again, is the hardest to admit. That's the resistance, right? What you mean, and that's why I know brainwashing is not always the best term, but it really feels like what happens. I mean, I don't have a better term for myself personally, and the way I associate that term is that I stopped thinking for myself. That my, I can say it more clinically, like my critical thinking had been eroded, but I really stopped trusting my own cognitive abilities and felt that in essence, my brain was the problem. and that I was lesser than or lacking or somehow brain damaged even possibly at times, and therefore couldn't trust this, and to then take back that mantle and say, listen, this is the best thing I have, and if it's only through using this that I'll really have a fighting chance, is a huge awakening. And but admitting that to yourself is really hard, really, really hard. The fact that you got that far down the road where you really just didn't even trust your own mind is hard to admit.
It's really true. Hard. And yeah. I think there's a fundamental mistake throughout contemporary thinking, which allows people very readily to create an enemy within.
Yeah.
A superego, as Freud called it. That which is above the ego, which is why he uses the word super, that which controls the ego, which is the internal policeman injected from the outside. Now, this isn't something that happened to us when we joined a cult group. This is an aspect of our society.
Yeah,
and it's expressed in all sorts of religions with the idea that you're inhabited by demons, dibuks, gdons, whichever language or practice you follow, that there's something inside you that is your enemy. In Sufi terms, you'll hear about the nafs, the idea of this internal physical self that has all of the lust and the desire and all of this stuff going on, which is distinct and separate from you. Now, this is where I think the mistake comes, that this idea of the unconscious mind, that there is this agency. So even in psychology, there is this agency which is represented.
Are you referencing kind of like Jung shadow? Is that kind of what you're meaning, or how? What do you...
Jung shadow fits into it. The anima, the animus in his ideas. All of these ideas that there is a separation of the self internally allow us to mimic and create an unconscious enemy. An enemy that we are not conscious of within ourselves, and that's not cultic. That's the whole world.
That's not the human condition. I mean, it's actually, I write movie scripts, and I'm usually drawn towards, rather than the classic. I mean, I love Joseph Campbell. Where you have the classic antagonist as another character. Very often, the stories I'm drawn to are the inner antagonist.
Yes.
That you are your own worst enemy. I mean, those are the stories that really resonate with me, that you've been wounded, that you're dealing with demons from that unresolved wound, that you've developed a coping mechanism which has now actually become the problem, and so you're trying to sort through to, in essence, have the transformation to just own all of it so that you can actually move forward and grow. And those type of stories, I think, resonate with me from my own personal journey, because I just know how that works. And that's not to say I don't love Star Wars and those type of classic storytelling tales, but the ones that I feel I have a better lens into because of my experience is that type of thing. And, I think that's, I guess it in line with what you're saying, I never cease to be amazed of the human capability to self-sabotage. I mean, it just seems to be encoded in all of us, and it's a constant battle. And not only do we have to recognize it in ourselves, but it's really important to recognize it in others, especially in our dealings with them, because quite often you see someone, and I know it's my tendency, I love to give everybody the benefit of the doubt and see what I see it's great about them, and not want to look at maybe some of those demons that are there that can be acted out in a very self-sabotage way that I will get, damaged just by being near to it, and that's some of the things that I have to continually work on, is not only my own self-sabotage proclivity, but others as well, and be careful and set boundaries and be aware that that is something that we all confront and battle with.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think what you're saying is, that is the vital story, the character arc, the transformation of the individual, redemption, and how an individual comes to terms with what they're doing. Let me clarify. I'm not saying that there aren't unconscious processes.
Right.
Human being. I'm saying there isn't a place, a mind that's thinking and determining, a Mr. Hyde that's fighting with Dr. Jekyll. Yeah. So the enemy within becomes something one of the things I realized was that human beings can mimic any condition. And it means that sometimes when you're dealing with somebody, they are pretending to be crazy. They are pushing themselves into a place of being crazy. And that we're all very capable of that. The self-sabotage is often us mimicking behaviors or thinking these are the right behaviors to have.
I completely agree with that. And I think for me, growing up, where I had quite a domineering mother who I felt like I could never really necessarily please all the time, and then getting involved with the cult, I became very good. They call it the people pleaser, phenomenon.
Yes, I know it well.
Yeah, exactly. So you get very good at monitoring the cues and giving what you think is the appropriate response to those cues, which is quite often just purely, as you're saying, performance based. Like from my life experience, when I see this person's behaving or wanting this thing, this is the proper response for them to like me or for me to avoid more pain. And so it's not just the natural response or organic response or genuine response. It's this constant stay a step ahead, follow the cues, and try to stay out of trouble, and hopefully the person won't notice. And it's a really, really difficult thing to break.
And if you add into that what I think I am the first person to call the empathy disorder, because we've got this idea it's a good thing, and to have a knee-jerk empathy response, I mean, we should be compassionate, absolutely.
Right.
But, as Paul Bloom at Yale says, it should be rational compassion so that we work out. I too am a people pleaser. That's my nature. And I don't think it was put to me by a professor of psychology a little while ago that we respond to things because we're afraid of pain or upset, and that we're conditioned in childhood in this way. And something really rankled in me with that idea. It was like, no, I wasn't trying to please people because they thought they'd hurt me. I was trying to please people because I wanted them to be happy.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a negative thing, except it is necessarily a negative thing, because it will lead you to a place where we get into the real trap. And I think reframing this whole problem is the big necessity. Steve Hassan and I, we've been working together. I don't know how long we've been working together. We've been working together for a long time. And we've come more and more, and my friend Christian Sherko, for whom I have the most tremendous respect, we're working towards this thing where what we're dealing with is authoritarianism. It's not cults or cultic behavior, what have you, even to the extent that Steve has renamed his model, his control model, as a model of authoritarian control of behavior, information, thought, and emotion. And I think it is that mentality. And I think you can go there without upsetting people about whether they are or aren't in a cult, which is a decision that may or may not be useful to them, which is to say, am I accepting the direction of another person? And is this the sort of person that likes directing other people? So an authoritarian bully, it's possible to be a good leader. I'm sure of it. But there aren't very many of them in history. Most of them are tyrants, monarchs and presidents and what have you. So taking away looking at this thing of authoritarianism in our culture, I need somebody to tell me what to do because I'm not clever enough. Rather than forming collaborative networks, I have people I can go to and ask questions of if I don't understand something, people I trust and can trust. But when you don't have that, when you submit to authority, when submission is a major aspect of your behavior, as it is for about 60% of people, I would say, the majority of people, they know better than I do. Donald Trump's a very stable genius who keeps beautiful, clean coal in his bathroom, probably. I don't know. That certainly there's this regard towards a person as an authority, not because they have expertise and can demonstrate they know how to do something, whether it be plumbing or surgery, but because they have a rank. They've been allowed to have a rank, and we're taught from the very beginning to be obedient to rank, to put our hands up when we need something, you know.
And that person has that need to be in that position as well, right? I mean,
yes.
that's part of the thing. It's like I love the point you raised between authoritarianism and collaboration. Like, you know, that collaboration, there's a sense of an even playing field. Now, you may all have different skill sets, and within those skill sets, others may be considered more of an expert or not, so to speak. But that doesn't mean you can't collaborate in a way where it's all constructive. You know, the authoritarianism means there needs to be like you're saying, a rank and file, a hierarchy that you know, someone's got to have the last say. And once that's said, there has to be like almost a devotion to that point of view. That's where obviously you're talking about something very unhealthy, and it's complicated by the fact that I think the line of least resistance is to accept someone telling you what to do. I mean, that's, again, this goes back to, I think, a point I made the last time we talked. I think we're always up against our predisposition as humans that we're kind of encoded to follow. You know, becoming a leader in your own life takes a very vigilant, you know, challenging approach to really kind of accept that is kind of your pre-wiring, and that if you want to really become the hero in your own life, it's going to take some work. It's very easy to kind of just go with the flow, go along with it all, and just not make waves. And yet it's very hard to admit that that's what's going on, and how that gets us in hot water. So, yeah, welcome to the human condition.
And I think, you know, I think we're in a very interesting time, because I think the possibilities have emerged that we could have democracy. We never had it, but we could have it if a majority of people decide to be responsible for themselves, decide to think for themselves. As soon as it gets past the 50% point, we could have a democracy. We could have consensus. We have situations where, rather than groupthink predominating, evidence could
I would love that to happen. I mean, I think that is the potential silver lining of our current situation. I certainly can speak more in my country than yours, but you know, it's become so polarized and become so extreme from those points of view. I think, and I'd like to believe and hope that more people are saying, okay, neither one of these is working. Like we've got to come somewhere in the middle here, you know. And I think that's what you're talking about. Like this extremism, whatever side you fall on, is not going to serve anybody, you know. And we have to move towards, as you were saying, collaboration rather than the authoritarianism. You know, I think the extremism, again, is asking for that same devotion. You know, that's generally why politics does not interest me, because I realize that there's so many authoritarian and cultic aspects to all of that, not only the way it's set up, but also how people who are expected to behave within those, you know, lines of thinking. So yeah, it's just I'm just like, I step away and I'm just like, boy, we got to figure out something other than this. The system isn't working. So I hope you're right. That would be incredibly encouraging to think that maybe we're moving towards a true democracy. That would be amazing.
Well, I think it's, you know, the first stage is getting past the denial, and that the denial in our civilization is the idea that we've found civilization, and you know, just looking at the horrors of a group like NXIVM or all of the deception and lies around Iraq and around ISIS and around Afghanistan, that putting people into that situation because you feel angry about something that's happened, you know. So George W. Bush and Tony Blair felt angry about 9/11. So they started what would be the the killing of almost 1 million people, 150,000 in Afghanistan, 750,000 in Iraq, to achieve absolutely nothing other than taking the group that performed 9/11, which had less than 480 members, even if you exaggerate the membership, because that actually covers 2 other groups that weren't involved with them. But it had a maximum of 480 members. By the time, a year after the Iraq War, it had 35,000 members. So that was how successful this hate campaign had been, and the division that it caused, rather than sort of going, well, what can we do to make the world a better place? It was, who can we punish for this having happened? And the reality is there was nobody from Iraq on those planes. Al-Qaeda was not an Iraqi organization. It was because Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and Tony Blair wanted to hurt somebody, Yeah,
and there were no weapons of mass destruction there. Yeah.
No chemical weapons, nothing. And in fact, of course, right next door, Syria, they did have chemical weapons, but nobody was too worried about that. And that's now given the Russians, at last, after playing the great game for, 200 years now, they have a foothold. Finally, they fought the whole Afghan war to try and get in there. Centuries they've been trying to break through, and now there they are. But that's a different and dreadful conversation. I do believe that we're in a period of waking up. I do believe that what we have learned from our experience within extreme authoritarian groups is absolutely relevant. When Margaret Singer and Janja Lalich wrote Cults in Our Midst, Margaret said to me, she said, it's because we're all living in a cult, that all of our society is cultic in its relationships. And I think we're understanding that better. And I think we're finding ways through. And by being able to identify predatory people and say, oh, they're very sad people, they're not the sort of people I should be following at all because they will abuse me. Identifying those people, pushing them aside, developing what my friend Ira Chalef calls courageous followership and intelligent disobedience, that everything could change. Because when you look at it, at the moment, our society is a horrible mess. It's not taking any real notice of the scientific understanding that we have of group behavior. Our educational system is still about 100 years ago. It really hasn't caught up with developing fully formed, mature individuals who will do creative and useful things in the world. It's still about creating drones who will be obedient, who will follow the rules, and often are actually not being told. I've recently been through curricula in biology, sociology, and psychology, which are being taught to 16-year-olds here. And all of them are about 20 to 25 years out of date. Nothing about epigenetics in a biology course for senior high school. You're kidding me. But the system perpetuates the system. So I actually, perhaps unlike many people at this time, feel tremendously optimistic about a change that can take place in humanity, as long as we do understand the lessons of history, as Santayana and, of course, Jim Jones both told us.
Oh. No, I share your optimism of hoping that I think people are waking up, and I think people are starting to recognize that a lot of their relationships are unhealthy and need to be labeled differently than they have in the past, because otherwise they don't really get the healing doesn't take place. And I think one of the things we have to do is start having this accepted nomenclature where we're all kind of recognizing we're talking about the same thing and using the same, I guess creating a positive loaded language that works for the world, that because right now there seems like there's so many losses in semantics that very often people are talking about the same things, but the words aren't the same as far as labels, and there's a lot of confusion and misinterpretation that takes place. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, when I first looked at the social sciences, when I left Scientology in the early 1980s, I was fascinated to see the same concepts described in completely different language in social psychology and sociology. So that distinction, that separation is difficult. I don't think we need a loaded language. I think we need to unload language. And I think there won't be that meaning behind it.
A language we all use that we're familiar with. Yeah, I hesitate using that word loaded because it's so negative, but I'm just saying a nomenclature that we all is accepted, that we all kind of use, and so that there's less chance for misunderstanding.
Yeah, a friend of mine many years ago, who's a philologist and has a master's degree in that, whatever it is, something about studying Phil or something. His thing is language and the study of language. And he introduced me to this concept of the snarl word and the purr word. And so the word appeasement is a snarl word.
Okay.
It means to negotiate, to satisfy another person. But because of what happened in Munich in 1938, it's a snarl word. The word democracy is a purr word. The word fascist is a snarl word. The word libtard, well, okay. And these words become loaded, but they can become loaded either way. They can be loaded as a positive or as a negative, as a snarl or a purr. I think getting past that and just having a language that isn't emotively inflected.
Yes.
All of this stuff about calling things new religious movements. I mean, I sat there with Professor Eileen Barker in the front row when I talked to Manchester at ICSA. And I said, all right, let's call them new religious movements, but can we accept that there are destructive new religious movements? And can we now move on? The idea that it's new religious or a movement doesn't mean it's healthy.
That's right. Okay, good. Did they accept that, or what did they say?
Well, actually, there were 4 times during that talk that I turned to Professor Barker, because we have been on slightly different sides of this discussion. We're neither of us extreme. She's not like Gordon Melton or Massimo Intravini or these people who just living in cloud cuckoo land, as far as I'm concerned. They just can't see that people are being hurt. And maybe they don't care, when Gordon Melton was paid by Scientology to simply rewrite their PR manual without checking anything, it's not good. But anyway, there were 4 times when I put questions to her and she could see that I had a recorder, I'm guessing, because she just went, And so that's a dialogue we haven't had,
Okay.
But, she's not the worst. But just to push all of that aside and say, look, Naomi Gibbons, who was in the Seduced, she talked to Dixer, and in fact, there's this funny voiceover where it's saying something about America, and you've got this actually film of her in Manchester in England. I know, because mine is the only face that's been blurred out, because I was not going to sign a release form that said that somebody could use my image for whatever purpose they liked. That's going a bit too far. But it was evident from what she went through there that it was too early for her to be talking about this. She broke down several times. But it was also evident, surely to anyone, that something truly horrific had happened to her. And to hide behind saying there's no such thing as brainwashing and cult's a rotten word, that's just verbiage. Yes. As soon as you stop caring about other people, it's like the sociologist going to Auschwitz and commenting on how smart the pajamas were, There are things that matter, and the fact that women were being branded with the initials of Keith A. Raniere, it's a reality. It happened. What are we going to do about it? Not how are we going to talk about the language with which to describe it.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm hopeful. I think we're going in the right direction.
The fact that he got the 120 years is a real precedent, and I think it's really potentially. Going to set things in the right direction in the States. We've never had a case of that scale that's actually gone down that way. So I think it really sets a precedent.
Yes, and it's wonderful that and the people who headed and led the criminal prosecution, kudos to them, because as you say, there have always been ways of evading it before.
I agree 100%. So let's hope there's more. And I know that's something that Steve Hassan's, wanting to do, change some of the legislation. So I think that it's something to really build upon. So I'm definitely optimistic.
Yeah, and we have the whole body of Alan Shefflin's work on predatory or undue influence over the decades, which has given his social influence model to us, which is a wonderful tool, which a judge can use, which a jury can use to determine whether a person has been put under an excess of influence. And the idea that we can just say, oh, there's this thing, brainwashing, and there's no such thing, rather than going, do you really believe it's impossible to influence another human being?
at the same time that you believe that there's some kind of unconscious stuff going on inside somebody, surely that means that you can reach in and get people to do things. You can deceive people, let alone anything else. You can lead them to believe that they will achieve heaven on earth as long as they do exactly what you tell them, which may seem crazy at the time, but but with Aaron, and there is a problem in politics, of course. This isn't a religious thing, it's a social thing. It's about multi-level marketing, about commercial cults, about all of these ways, which are the same ways, the ways that you create gangs, the way you create terrorist groups, and the way you create political parties. That Absolutely. When they go wrong, you get Mao Zedong and 70 million people dead, with not even a hint of religion. So it's about fanaticism, belief, and authoritarianism, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if you ever saw that documentary. I think it's called The Art of Killing.
I don't.
I was not even aware until I saw the documentary that 20 million Indonesians were executed in the 60s because of the wave of communism, from China. They had these literally local tribunals where each village kind of had them, where they would bring anyone who they suspected in for an interview. And in that interview, they determined from their point of view that you were communist, you went through that door and you were executed. Yeah. And they actually employed the local kind of gangsters to carry out the executions, which were happening sometimes 25, 40, 50 a day. And this documentary was talking, and I didn't even know that happened in the 60s.
Yeah.
Not that long ago.
It's the Year of Living Dangerously, the Mel Gibson movie, which I think Linda Hunt won an Oscar, quite right.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't really explain that's, Sukarno, the transfer of power, nor does it get into the incredible backing that both Britain and the US gave so that globalization could begin, that this population, and Britain in Malaysia and Borneo was killing off communists. Vietnam was happening, Laos and Cambodia. I watched Swimming to Cambodia again this week for the first time in many years. And for several years, I've been waiting until I could show the killing fields to my son, Sam. And he's 18 now, so he's old enough, so that I could show him swimming to Cambodia. Yeah. And you realize the enormity of this, the way that millions of deaths, the East Timor massacres in Indonesia as well, millions of deaths have just been, wiped over, and those people they're gone, and that's that. And
it's the horrors, yeah.
And hopefully we can move towards, something where the vicious, narcissistic, solipsistic authoritarians are moved out of power, where people like Duterte, for example, who says that he has said, my only crime is the extrajudicial killings. Yeah, it's like, so you didn't steal from shops,
right?
Or, hotwire somebody's car. The only thing you've done wrong is murder people.
That's it.
Okay.
Oh my God.
So
we always have hope, right?
Yeah, and places have changed, and things have, it certainly. You're looking back into the 19th century in this country. 4-year-old children were sent down the mines and worked as pit ponies. 4-year-old children were sent up chimneys. Yes. And if they got stuck there, they were left there. Oh. This was, is not unheard of. Girls as young as 7 or 8 years old were sold for gin. There was no law of any age of consent. It was 12 when it eventually came in. The French still don't have one, apparently. No. So there you go. Don't go to France if you're under the age of 18. That's what I say. But things have changed so much. I mean, even looking at the post-Second World War period, where America basically restored much of the world that was restored. But looking at the poverty that had been normal in this country, it's absolutely normal. I read a book by a history professor who's a professor in Florida, but he grew up in Lancashire here. And he talked about them, they would lick all of the last bit of fat off the plate because they were starving, these children. And that was in the 1920s in this country, 1930s in this country. So things have changed, but because we're not necessarily keeping track of history, we don't see how much they've changed. And we don't necessarily understand they have to change for the whole world, and that whether we like it or not, everything is connected. So if we're horrible and mean to anyone, then it's not going to be good for humanity. So we have to take up the welfare of humanity as our new cult, as our new dedication.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, we'll have to keep having these conversations. That's the only way it keeps going, right?
And to encourage other people to have these conversations, and to understand that no matter if you and I do sound knowledgeable and clever, we can be wrong. And that what's best is for people to go and check and work it out for themselves, and but not get caught up in some echo chamber of where David Icke is telling them what to think.
That is for sure.
Oh dear.
Think for themselves. All right. Well, great.
Yeah. What a great pleasure it is chatting with you.
Always, John. Always look forward to our chats. It's great.
So we'll say goodbye for the moment. I'm Jon Atack. This is Hoyt Richards, my good friend, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
No, thank you so much.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
We could form a club.